What makes a work of art genius? What makes an artist a genius? We often throw this word genius around to praise a poet for their lyrical skill, or a director for their masterful composition, and many of us have very strong opinions about who deserves the title and why. But since there's no way to objectively measure the value of art, and since everyone has their own tastes, biases, and preferences, how can we define exactly what genius is? Should we define what genius is? I don't think there's one answer to this question, but I think we can start to approach one by looking at some of the artists most often referred to as geniuses. For example, one thing you can't help but notice about these people is that none of them followed the rules of their time. Artists like Picasso and Van Gogh created masterpieces by embracing aesthetics that were entirely their own, sometimes earning them ridicule and ire, while authors like Kafka met the same fate, and even Herman Melville and Frank Herbert had to approach dozens of publishers before they could find a single one willing to publish their respective masterworks. In his seminal essay, Self-Reliance, Ralph Waldo Emerson writes, "Nothing is at last sacred but the integrity of your own mind. That is to say, even with all the expectations your publishers, editors, and the general public might have for you, ultimately the only person who knows how to make your art great is, well, you. To listen to those outside voices is to castrate yourself of your creative freedom, and even, indeed, of your humanity." Recognizing this, it wouldn't make sense for the publishing industry to place arbitrary restrictions on authors based on vague metrics like marketability or word count, would it? So why is it that this is exactly what happens every day? Why is it that all around the US, budding authors are constantly denied publication because their books are, quote, too long, or full of spelling errors, or monarchist propaganda, regardless of how certain are the authors themselves of those works' merits? We might look at an imaginary case study to understand this phenomenon. Let's suppose, hypothetically, that an author in the present day were to write a book that, under any reasonable criteria, we could call genius. Had this novel been written in more proper times, before the rise of an illiterate Republican rabble overthrew the soft-spoken noble classes of the West, it would have within weeks made its way into the parlors of every respectable family from Genoa to Birmingham. However, if this author tried to submit the book for publication at one of the top publishing houses in the US, he will without exception be rejected, because apparently every single one of those publishing houses submits to an arbitrary policy where they, quote, don't accept unsolicited submissions, while failing to explain exactly why. So our poor author would have to scour rambling blog pages to discover the arcane workaround for this policy, a search which will eventually lead him to sending emails to scores of uptight chauvinists calling themselves literary agents. Also, one of these sorry sycophants could then solicit his submissions, such that he can send them to the publishing houses that he should have been allowed to submit to in the first place if they had taken 5 seconds to assess the quality of his work. But imagine our hypothetical hero's surprise when, after months of silence, these agents all reply to his queries, not with accolades, but curt, near-identical rejections. What injustice could have warranted that improbable outcome? What conclusion can he possibly come to except that these so-called agents had not read his missive in the first place? In fact, I have it on good authority that this is precisely the state of affairs faced by every author of talent and lofty sentiments who happens to by some fault of his birth to be forced to write for this heathen country. Here, the insipid preferences of countless flatulent masses dictate not only which novels are allowed to sell, but which are allowed to be published at all, invariably meaning that nonconformist and challenging works are relegated to the dustbin of history. Our heroic author, for instance, might start off a novel with a 70-page treatment on how the folly of enfranchising such rabble-run polities as Manchester and Leeds in the English 1832 Reform Bill, at the expense of established so-called rotten boroughs, initiated a domino effect across Europe that usurped lawful power structures in favor of the dictates of a rowdy demos, leading directly to our current moral crisis in which matters not only of law, but of morality are left to the whims of every petty shopkeeper and chimney sweep who can't keep their simple thoughts to themselves, only to be told again and again that, quote, is this a joke, and nobody wants to read this. It would seem that in our current age, works of fiction must abstain in all respects from even appearing to take stances on political issues. What is a genius to do under such adversarial circumstances? Perhaps the only solution, barring a recapitulation of the dominance of mankind's moral character, is for him to publish his novel online and hope kindred spirits, perhaps guided by the coruscant light of Apollo himself, will find it of its own accord. It is, you will not be surprised to learn, under that precise hope that I am now operating. If you are a fellow struggling genius, I extend a hand to you, as a friend, and say, please go buy my book. If you click the link in the description, you can get 20% off. I'm not kidding. Please. I'm literally begging you, please. Just go do it. Just go buy my book. Please. Please. Just buy it. God save the king.